They only showed up when the battle was at its most intense, and there was little chance of them ever returning. On the black sands of the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marines were forced to unleash the most haunting weapon they possessed, the flamethrower. The weapon could burn through fortified bunkers and smoke out deep tunnels, but the price for its wielders was brutal. Most of them could not last more than 4 minutes in the fierce fire. This story is more than a weapon. It is a mirror of hell on earth, a path that soldiers willingly entered, knowing full well that it would be a path of blood and fire. Newly released documents and rare memories from living witnesses reveal the truth about the fierce confrontation between fire and cold lava on the bloodiest island in the Pacific. But before we get to the fire, we must talk about the rock. Iwo Jima was no peaceful island. It loomed like a giant wound in the ocean, covered in black sand and sulfurous fumes. It was only 8 square miles in size, but it was barren and unforgiving. No trees to shade it, no fresh water to drink, no shelter from the bombs. It was both desolate and oppressive. But for the U.S. command, its value far exceeded its diminutive size. Iwo Jima was located directly on the route between the Mariana Islands and mainland Japan, making it an indispensable choke point. From there, B-29 Superfortress missions bound for Japan could receive air support, refuel, or find an emergency landing site. It was this location that made the barren volcanic island a strategic link and thus a target that had to be won at all costs, no matter how terrible the cost. If the Americans took control of the island, they would have a lifeline for downed B-29s and a perfect launching pad for fighter escorts for bombing missions into the heart of Japan. But if they failed, Iwo Jima would become a giant cemetery in the middle of the Pacific. The Japanese had seen this scenario coming months before the battle began, and they decided to prepare for it in an unprecedented way. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the commander charged with holding the island, knew that old defensive tactics would only lead to quick defeat. So instead of open trenches or predictable lines of defense, he ordered Iwo Jima's underground to be transformed into a maze of death. Hundreds of bunkers, fortified positions, and interconnected tunnels crisscrossed the island, creating an underground fortress that would make any attacker pay in blood. The entire island was turned into a giant trap. The Japanese dug more than 11 miles of tunnels into the ground, connecting their positions in a tangled web. Inside the volcano, command bunkers, mortar nests, machine gun bunkers, and supply depots were buried deep and fortified with steel and concrete. All were so well camouflaged that even reconnaissance planes overhead would have difficulty detecting them. Their intentions were not complicated, but chillingly cruel. The only goal, to make the Americans pay in blood until they were exhausted. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, unlike many Japanese commanders of his time, understood that defeat was only a matter of time. He knew that the United States, with its vast resources, would eventually win. But that did not stop his determination to turn every inch of the island into a death trap, forcing the enemy to think twice before landing on the Japanese homeland. Kuribayashi's strategy was cold and practical: prolong the battle, ambush in silence, and sacrifice without mercy. He absolutely forbade suicide attacks or useless battle cries. Instead, the Americans would have to face the darkness from underground, the guns waiting around every turn, and the sudden death from below. Not the noise of suicide attacks, but the heavy, lurking, inescapable silence. In February 1945, when the United States Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they were not just stepping onto a small island in the middle of the ocean. They were entering a giant killing machine, a volcano that had been transformed into an underground fortress, ready to slowly and surely crush each unit. At dawn on February 19th, the campaign opened with an unprecedented firestorm. Gunboats from the American fleet rained down fierce rounds. The ground shook constantly. In the sky, bombers continuously swooped in, dropping tons of explosives on the island. Smoke billowed. Deep bomb craters plowed the ground. The sky was red with fire and ash. The Americans believed that nothing could survive under that rain of bombs and bullets. But in reality, all of this was just the prelude to a long nightmare that awaited them ahead. The bombs and artillery barrages seemed to destroy everything, but in reality, they were only hitting empty positions. The Americans did not know that their enemy had disappeared from sight, hidden deep underground. There was no one in the open trenches, no targets in the visible bunkers. Only the hidden steel doors, then miles of underground tunnels filled with silent Japanese soldiers waiting for the decisive moment. And then, the landing began. Each Higgins boat rushed ashore, opening its doors to release wave after wave of Marines onto the thick black sand. Thousands of American soldiers advanced, thinking that before them was just a desolate beach after a rain of bombs. But the ground beneath their feet was not the fine golden sand of Normandy. It was volcanic ash, heavy and deeply embedded, making each step slow and exhausting. Each soldier who had just left the boat had to struggle through the harsh terrain, unaware that in the darkness right below their feet, the enemy was holding his breath, ready to pull the trigger. The sand on Iwo Jima was unlike any other. It was a fine volcanic ash, soft and sticky, swallowing every step, weighing down boots and bogging down rolling tanks. Every meter of advance was a struggle, many Marines forced to crawl under the weight of their equipment. There was not a tree, not a rock, not a single place to take cover. There was only endless dark ground, and above them, a sky filled with the smoke of bombs. Yet, strangely, everything was quiet. For more than an hour after landing, not a shot was fired from the Japanese. The young soldiers began to reassure themselves that the recent bombardment had paralyzed all resistance. They believed that perhaps the battle would not be as fierce as they had expected. But among the ranks were tense faces, and the experienced veterans were more cautious. For them, this silence did not bring safety, but a harbinger of a coming bloodstorm. As the last waves of the landing party rolled onto the sand, the silence was shattered. From their hidden bunkers and cleverly camouflaged mountain slopes, the Japanese opened fire. In an instant, the beach was inferno. Artillery fired accurately into the shallows, and columns of water and fire erupted among the huddled Higgins boats. Machine guns screeched across the black sand, cutting down scores of soldiers who had just landed. Mortars rained down from above, exploding among the crowd seeking shelter with nowhere to hide. In a matter of minutes, the atmosphere that had initially carried the confidence of victory had turned into chaos. The shouts of instructions were drowned out by explosions, screams of pain, and the clash of metal. The newly formed confidence was swept away, replaced by horror, as the Americans realized that they were standing in the exact place where the enemy had prepared to kill them for months. Bodies fell so quickly that medics had no time to reach them. Radios blared in a cacophony of conflicting orders and desperate cries for help. Black smoke billowed from the shelled vehicles, turning the beach into a maze of flames. The first Marines to reach the shore were still trying to crawl up the slope, but before they could reach safety, they were pushed back by new waves of men pouring down from the Higgins boats behind them. Each advance only made them easier targets for the guns waiting above. Such was the ruthless art of Kurebayashi's plan. The Japanese did not fire while the Americans were still in the water, but let them pour onto the sand in large numbers, believing the path ahead was clear. Then suddenly they blocked the retreat with a dense net of fire. In an instant, thousands of Marines were trapped, hunted, with no way out. It was not just a fight, it was a calculated trap, both cold and brutal. Kurebayashi had no intention of holding the beachhead. His goal was to turn the entire area into a giant meat grinder, and the tactic proved to be brutally effective. As the Marines pushed deeper into the island, they never felt like they had escaped the abyss. Before them lay a landscape scarred by craters, dark tunnels leading to nowhere, and attacks coming from all directions. There was no concept of front or rear. On Iwo Jima, death could strike from anywhere, at any time. A bunker might collapse in flames, but soon the Japanese would emerge from a tunnel behind it and resume firing as if nothing had happened. By then, American officers were forced to admit conventional artillery could not decide the battle. The deeper the Marines pushed into Iwo Jima, the more twisted, strange, and nightmarish the war became. No place was safe, and there was no clear line between front and rear. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a submerged fortress, where attackers never knew what they were about to encounter. What made this fortress so terrifying was its bunkers. They were not simply blocks of deadly concrete, but rather traps designed by the hand of war. Each bunker was built to withstand the direct impact of both tanks and naval fire. Their entrances were cleverly hidden behind the cliffs, at an angle that made it difficult for artillery shells to penetrate. The machine gun and artillery positions were carefully camouflaged and arranged overlapping, so that when one bunker opened fire, it simultaneously protected and supported the next bunker. A Marine can't just charge straight into an enemy. If he does, he'll instantly be targeted by another gunman he hasn't even seen. Danger lurks just below. Most bunkers are connected by elaborate underground tunnels. You can blow up a bunker with a grenade or explosive and move on, but the Japanese can sneak up behind it in an instant, ready to ambush you. On Iwo Jima, Marines had to move forward. They were forced to fight invisible enemies all around them, from behind, from the flanks, and even from underground. Personal weapons like grenades, rifles, and explosives were only useful when they could get close to their targets. But to do that, a soldier had to crawl across the open sand, under a barrage of machine gun fire that swept every inch of the ground. Even when a unit was lucky enough to reach a bunker, the ordeal was not over. Most of these bunkers were designed in a zigzag pattern, with chambers connecting chambers, so the blast of grenades and explosives was often absorbed by the walls. The defenders inside were thus safe, ready to fire again seconds after the dust cleared. Every advance by the American soldiers meant blood, and the result was sometimes as good as standing still. The battle for Iwo Jima became a struggle for every inch of land, and it was this struggle that wore the Marines down to their bones. In the stalemate, a forgotten solution emerged: the flamethrower. It was not a new weapon. It had been around since World War I and had gradually fallen into disuse. But on this volcanic island, it was the only option. Because fire did not care about zigzag walls, nor was it held back by tight corners or the lack of oxygen in bunkers. When the fire broke through, everything inside suffered the same fate. The fire was not contained by steel doors or thick concrete walls. It seeped into every crevice, swallowing the air and turning the bunker into a hermetically sealed furnace, from which escape became impossible. The Marines, carrying heavy fuel tanks and spraying rods, became the very men who spread the flames underground. With only pistols for protection and flames as weapons, they were forced to unleash hell on those hiding inside. But the devastation wrought by the flames was only the tip of the iceberg. The true darkness of war began to emerge when we saw the terrible cost borne by the flamethrowers themselves. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, the first weapon the U.S. Marines deployed was not a gun or a tank, but the M2 flamethrower, a machine of terror. To operate it required not only strength, but also blind recklessness. When fully fueled, the entire device weighed nearly 70 pounds, strapped to the back in the form of 2 tanks of flammable liquid and a tank of compressed air in between. The man carrying it was like carrying a live bomb, waiting for the first spark to explode into inferno. Inside the heavy steel tanks was a thick mixture of gasoline and diesel fuel, a sticky, flammable liquid that stuck to any surface and burned it relentlessly. The nozzle was designed like a rifle, with a white phosphorus igniter at the muzzle. When the soldier pulled the trigger, a column of red fire would shoot out, stretching more than 30 meters, nearly 28 meters. and lasting about 10 seconds. Those 10 seconds, short but enough to turn an entire underground bunker or fortified bunker into an inferno. It was a fine line between life and death. Every flamethrower knew it. They had only one shot, one column of fire, before their fuel tanks ran out, and then they themselves became the most lucrative target on the battlefield. Because the Japanese were never wrong. When they recognized the silhouette of a flamethrower, they focused all their fire on him first. On Iwo Jima, the weapon was more than a tool of war. It was a symbol of terror, feared and hated more than anything else. With the first burst of flame, the soldier with the M2 immediately became the center of attention on the battlefield. Every rifle shot, every grenade, every mortar round rained down on him. In the eyes of the Japanese, the flamethrowers were not human, but demons incarnate. So the orders from the officers were clear. Take them down first at any cost. The end for these soldiers was often tragic. Many fell before they could retreat, while others fell into enemy hands, facing a fate worse than death on the battlefield. For American soldiers, it was a nightmare even more terrifying than artillery fire. One veteran said he once witnessed a comrade with a flamethrower rush into the cave entrance, pull the trigger, but the weapon did not work. In the blink of an eye, 2 Japanese soldiers rushed out, knocked him down, and dragged him into the dark tunnel. For the next 2 days, soldiers on the battlefield could still hear his cries for help, his screams from deep within the rock. Then finally, the sound stopped. No one could go back to pull him out. That's why many flamethrowers left behind chilling last words. If they were to fall into enemy hands, they begged their comrades to kill them immediately. They knew full well the horrors that awaited them, and for those lucky enough to return alive, silence was the only option. Because not everyone could speak of what they had witnessed. The screams in the darkness, the smell of burning flesh in the air, or the image of fire engulfing people in underground tunnels. They not only carried a heavy weapon on their backs, but also had to bear the haunting memories that weighed heavily on their minds. Those memories were so persistent that many collapsed even long after the war had ended. Even if they survive and return home, many veterans still face nightmares that haunt them for the rest of their lives. Flamethrowers are terrifying not only because of their destructive power, but also because of the cruelty they impose on the human conscience. It is not about pulling the trigger from hundreds of meters away, but watching with your own eyes as flames consume lives just a few feet away. And while most who have held such weapons claim that they were just doing their duty, many later confess that deep down, they have never truly gotten over the memory. The M2 did more than just spit fire. It unleashed a heat storm, scorching the surrounding space with temperatures exceeding 480 degrees Celsius. In cramped bunkers or stifling caves, the fire not only burned, but also sucked out all the oxygen, turning the atmosphere into a suffocating furnace in an instant. The heat and lack of oxygen caused many enemy soldiers to collapse almost instantly. Post-war medical documents claim that most victims lost consciousness before feeling any pain. However, other studies have questioned the truth, suggesting that the truth may be more brutal. But for the soldiers who pulled the trigger, flamethrowers were never associated with a sense of justice. They left them with an unnamed torment. One veteran told of the time he used fire to flood a bunker. When the fire died down and the smoke cleared, he went in to investigate. The sight was so horrific that his stomach churned, and he collapsed and vomited on the spot. Then he sat quietly outside, saying nothing, until his superiors forced him to stand up and continue his mission as if nothing had happened. There was no room for weakness or conscience on that battlefield. And then, in addition to the flamethrowers, there were the giant steel machines, tanks. They were easy targets, under constant fire from the enemy. Many Marines believed that a single round to the fuel tank would turn the entire vehicle into a fireball. In reality, that was not the case. The fuel was tightly packed and did not act like a bomb. But that didn't matter much. On the battlefield, that belief was enough to strike fear into anyone who had to sit in that hot metal compartment. Just thinking about how a small mistake could turn you into a human torch is enough to make your legs heavy with every step. The greatest fear comes not from the fire, but from the psychological toll it leaves behind. Many soldiers who once operated flamethrowers, after witnessing the terrible consequences firsthand, firmly refused to continue handling this weapon. Some begged to be transferred, others threw up before going into battle. Even decades later, when the war was long over, there were still veterans who confessed that they never had the courage to tell their families what they had done. On the battlefield, the flamethrower proved its terrible effectiveness, but the emotional cost it left behind was immeasurable. That fire had turned the tide of battle many times, rescuing comrades from seemingly hopeless battles. But for the men who carried the weapons, it had become a crushing burden. When commanders realized that flamethrowers were falling faster than they could replenish them, they knew a new solution was needed. The answer lay not in throwing more men to their deaths, but in sending a cold steel machine onto the battlefield, one that was even more terrifying than a flamethrower. As the number of flamethrowers falling reached a terrifying level, more than 9/10 never returned, commanders were forced to make a cold but practical choice: trap the flames in the armor. So a special variant was created from the familiar chassis of the M4A3 Sherman, replacing the 75mm gun with a giant flamethrower. It was called the Flame Sherman, and as these machines roared into Iwo Jima, the nature of war changed forever. While the M2 on its back could only sweep fire at 30 yards, the Flame Sherman could unleash nearly 3 times that amount of heat, at nearly 100 yards. The flamethrower had only a 10-second countdown to life or death, while the tank carried more than 300 gallons of fuel, enough to unleash column after column of fire. And the most important difference, its thick armor. That allowed the Flame Sherman to get close to bunkers and bunkers without fear of being crushed by machine guns. But the Flame Sherman's thick armor did not make it invulnerable. On the dusty ground of Iwo Jima, its tracks bogged down easily, making it a slow target in the middle of a battlefield. The Japanese knew that to knock out a flamethrower would mean to suffocate the entire attack. So every time the Sherman fired, it became a target for all manner of weapons, from hidden mines to explosives-laden pits to suicide bombers charging straight into its smoking steel. Flamethrower tanks were always on the top of the list of targets. With the crew locked in the metal compartment, just one shell hitting a vital spot could turn the entire crew into torches in the blink of an eye. But they did not stop. Sherman crews worked closely with infantry, using cover fire to clear the way. The flame-bearing Shermans were often pushed up the front of the attack, crawling straight to the mouth of a tunnel or bunker, then releasing a column of fire so ferocious that it melted metal and crushed all obstacles in an instant. Psychiatrists who studied the aftermath of World War II found that soldiers who operated flamethrowers often bore more severe psychological scars than most of their comrades. They didn't just kill their enemies, they destroyed them in ways that defied human instinct. Images of burning flesh, of screams swallowed by thick smoke were seared into memory, buried but never gone. By the 1970s, the military officially retired the flamethrower. On paper, the reason was that it had become obsolete in the face of more modern weapons. But the real reason was harder to admit. It was too brutal to be accepted. Though it disappeared from service, its shadow never disappeared. For those who carried it, it was a heavy memory. For those who faced it, it was an unforgettable horror. And for the world, its image still haunts collective nightmares. Since Iwo Jima, flamethrowers have been seen not as a legitimate means of war, but as a landmark exposing the darkest frontiers of human violence. Gradually, nations quietly withdrew flamethrowers from their arsenals. Among scholars and military ethicists, debates arose about whether the use of such weapons should be classified as a war crime. As these questions reverberated, the international community began to draft agreements to limit them. By 1980, The United Nations had enacted the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which formally placed incendiary weapons under strict control. While flamethrowers are not outright banned, their use in civilian areas or against civilians is now strictly controlled. Even modern militaries, including the United States, are cautious, limiting their deployment as much as possible. The issue is no longer just a matter of tactical effectiveness. It is a matter of conscience, because the very nature of flamethrowers forces us to confront the harsh reality of war. Without glory, only horror. Not the flags of victory or the glittering medals, but the screams and the hail of bullets that define war. No other weapon brings a soldier close to the enemy, forcing him to destroy them directly with his own hands, like the flamethrower. The men on Iwo Jima who carried that weapon did not want it. They were not monsters. They were just Marines, given only one choice: to use it to survive on a battlefield designed to kill them. They were living weapons, walking flames, sent into the darkness, knowing that most would never return. Of the 335 flamethrowers sent to Iwo Jima, only 18 survived. The casualty rate was 92%. Most fell before they could fire a shot. Some were captured when the flames died down. Those who returned were no longer themselves, but they had done their job, because in this ash hell there was no other choice. Eventually, Iwo Jima fell to the American Army. The flag was raised, bowing over the ash and rock, a victory mark in a land that had once been hell. The war in the Pacific moved one step closer to the Japanese mainland, but for those who bore the flame, victory came at a price that history rarely mentions. They survived, but none of them were unscathed, neither in body nor in soul. The memories of the craters, the burning caves, and the echoing screams remained with them for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that is why this story is so indelible, because there are weapons that leave wounds that time cannot heal, and there are men who bear burdens that no steel, no metal can help them endure. These soldiers fought, they survived, but the price they paid is forever etched in their footsteps.